Great. Okay, let's see. All right. Looks like we're recording. Okay, great. So I have with me today Glenis Redmond, who is the author of What My Hands Say. She's a poet, she's a teaching artist, and I love the way you are also defined as an imagination activist. So, first of all, I want to just say thank you for being here with me today.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. I also understand that you have earned the nickname Road Warrior Poet. Is that true?
Exactly. That's because no one told me that it was impossible to travel around the country as a single mom and uh, put 35 to 40,000 miles on my vehicle every year, spreading the love and power of poetry. So that's where the Road Warrior title came from.
I love that. I love the way you phrased that, even just that no one told you you couldn't. I think so often we are stopped by somebody saying, no, you can't do that. And then we think, oh, maybe that's true. And then we don't just go out and do it. Good for you.
Don't know if someone would have said it was impossible, I probably still would have done it anyway. But it was one of those things that when you're driven, and I know I'm playing on a metaphor because I'm driving, but I had drive on top of drive.
Right.
And I felt poetry was a way to save my own life. And so I thought if it was useful for me, it would be useful for others. And here we are in the 28th year of being a teaching artist and a poet and road weary warrior.
um, you used the words saved yourself, that it saved you. Could
Yes.
you talk about what that means for you?
Well, I'm talking about it literally and figuratively. I was diagnosed 29 years ago with fibromyalgia, and that was before anybody really understood the condition. A lot of people dismissed it to, it's all in your head, but I was a very uh, physically fit person. And after I had my twins, uh, my health started to fail. And I was a counselor too for the state of South Carolina at the time. And I just was not feeling well. I wasn't feeling well physically or emotionally. And finally, I went on disability. And I remember my boss telling me, you need to take some time off. And I did. I took time off and I never went back.
Mm.
Lo and behold, I was watching Language of Life, a Bill Moyer special on PBS. And it was a poetry festival. It was the Dodge Poetry Festival, and there was a poet, and her name is Lucille Clifton, and I won't recite the poem, but at the end she said, come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed.
Wow. Yeah.
And with a person with fibromyalgia, with all, because it's a complex, it was, your muscle pain, fatigue, fog, interstitial cystitis, which is a bladder issue, TMJ, a carpal tunnel. It's all of these things. It's all of these things combined. So I literally every day all those somethings were feeling like that they were adding up to try to kill me. So when I heard her say that, it lit a fire in me. It did not cure the fibromyalgia, but it gave me a sense of, oh, there is something you can do to pour your passion and your focus into. And so that's what I mean, that poetry really got me off the couch, AKA Lucille Clifton, and also a poet by the name of Rumi Coleman Barks was reciting at that same festival. And he's a translator of Rumi, who's I think 13th century, 14th century, I can't remember which century, mystic poet. And all of these words, all of these images came to me and basically just started to guide me and say, there's another way to live your life. And poetry was the other way. And so I felt like poetry just kind of reached in with its long arm and lifted me up off the couch, off my sick bed.
Wow. That is beautiful. And I want to quote from one of your poems. You talk about making something out of nothing.
Right, right. That's is that story? Yeah, that's the story.
Stories. Yeah. It makes it it brings to mind for me immediately the creative process itself. And yeah,
True.
so it's
It's so interesting that you pick that line because if I have a through line, that's really one of the through lines. That making something out of nothing didn't come from me. It came from my mother and my grandmother and my great grandmother, who to me were the original artists and creators. They would never consider themselves. We're talking about people who were enslaved, who were sharecroppers, who were blue collar workers, all amazing homemakers, but they were the ones who, if I would say my early professors, were those women, and they taught me how to make something out of nothing with their quilts, you
Mm,
know. And these were utilitarian quilts. These were not traditional quilts, quote unquote. I mean, they're traditional in our community, but they were made out of cast-offs,
yeah.
uniforms and curtains and outgrown clothes and sheets and everything. And that beauty, that rustic beauty taught me, you use what you have at hand. It is no excuse to say you do not have the money or the funds. You use what you have at hand. And that's where I was schooled. These women had their PhD in making something out of nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. And it calls up also one of the phrases that I know is repeated in many of your poems is that piece by piece.
Mm.
Piece by piece.
And that's a play on words, right? So it's piece by piece, like piecing a quilt together. But it's also peace, as in wanting to have peace in the world. And the
Mm.
way to have that peace is to bring the threads together, bring all of this, bring all of this together. And some way we make an uneasy peace. And, because it's hard to be completely peaceful in these social and political times, but these times, I talked to my mother about it. Who's 83, and please don't tell her I put her age out there. um, she would say we've seen these times before. She said, I was born into these times. Your grandmother and your great grandmother was born into these times.
Yeah.
And so I was born in 1963. I was born the day before King gave his I Have a Dream speech. So I call myself a King baby,
Mhm.
a King dream baby. And I feel like my work has this focus, and I'm deliberate about looking at what makes us uneasy and uncomfortable, because I don't have a choice. I mean, I was, born into South Carolina in 1963, where on my birth certificate, my race was stamped Negroid.
Mm.
And, I've been writing about that in the next work to come. Of what does that mean to come into the world with stamped Negroid? Or
Mm.
my parents went to Fountain Inn Negro High School. Just these things have always been with us. So I'm always looking at how to make understanding and peace from those conditions.
Yeah. It's really interesting that in the delivery of audio that that phrase piece by piece, we don't have a visual clue that's saying, "Oh, it's this thing." It actually, I think, increases that potential for us to find both more quickly.
Heck yeah, I love that. It's so, because I do think I believe in audio. So, which is what is a wonderful format for me, because I get termed as a performance poet, which I don't necessarily claim that. It's just my delivery. People say, well, where did you train? I said, are you kidding me? I went to a Black Baptist church. I'm Southern, African roots. I mean, it's just in me. I'm an extrovert. I mean, I'm one of 5 kids. I mean, are you kidding? This is just not me performing. This is me being myself. But saying all that, the Inuit believe that poetry is breath. And so when you hear breath behind a word, or you hear this wordplay, or you don't even know it's wordplay, I think that when you hear it in the poet's voice, the meaning can be pushed forth, and it's layers of meaning. And
Yeah.
you're not always unpacking it consciously, but it's all around you.
Yeah.
You get it. And so that's why I love the audio, and people can experience the poetry on another level. I think it elevates the form.
Yeah. I think that's so true. That's beautiful. I love what you said about the Inuit and that the breath. inspiration, all of that pulling together in this way.
Sure, because I come from several call and response cultures,
Yeah.
the church culture, although my ideology is very different from what it was when I was growing up, but I still embrace the music and the call and response. The West African thread is in me, the Southern thread, all of that give and take. And I think the audience, is involved in the poetry in that way, because I think the poem is performing. I think we are, and I don't even want to use the word performing. I think we're in conversation. And we can be in conversation over time. It could be hundreds of years still in conversations. All of these great orators. I mean, I know one that's been pulled up a lot lately because we just went through 4th of July was, Frederick Douglass, and talking about what does 4th of July mean to the Negro. And so we are in conversation with Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Tubman and all these people who've gone before us. And that's what my hand say is doing. I'm in conversation with my great grandfather, Will Rogers, who I never met.
Yeah.
But because it's so important for our stories not to get lost. The poet's job is not the historian's job. We do want to be historically accurate, but we also want to fill in the spaces of a culture that did not have the ability to write it down. And so the artist will put their heart to ground, ear to ground, and say, what were they saying? What were their lives? And so that is the conversation that I'm having, and these poems are born a lot of times out of impressions of the land and conversations that I've heard people in my family have. And, it makes artists, I think, very curious people. We're in
Yeah.
here conversations with people from the 1800s.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the in "Don't Go Back," one of the poems, you I was really struck with that urging, "Don't go back," which is not obviously you're not in your poetry choosing not to go back. You actually are going back and continuing that conversation. But I think I was particularly noting it in these times that we have right now where more people are where there's more media out there. I just personally just watched the documentary 13th. There's more people who are waking up to the systemic racism, the systemic problems, and the reasons why those those were put in place by those in authority. Um, that that the So I just found that don't go back. There is an energy around some desire to not look at that. Is that what you're referencing?
Well, there's a line there, and it may be in the book, another in other places, but even in that poem stories, and it's not me saying don't go back,
Right.
it's people saying don't go back, and because they're offended, by, and my retort in the poem, I'm saying, I'm not busy with blame. My eyes are intent on the stitch working the pieces,
Mm.
and so the don't go back is a lot of times where people are like, why go to the past, why bring up all of this um, uh, horrible weighted history? And my thing is, no problem has ever been solved by sweeping it under the rug, and America in 2020 is dealing with all of this uh, sweeping under the rug of history and acts and events, and now it's coming to head in a way that it hasn't come to head before. And that's why we have these Confederate statues that are tumbling. This is why we're looking at our past presidents who were slave owners in different ways, and things that we've been saying all along, trying to get the Confederate flag out of the flag in Mississippi. It was in South Carolina on the state capitol and then to the state grounds. It took many, many years for those things. And what is the harm in that? And people will say, well, it's heritage, not hate. But from my perspective, it's a heritage that is rooted in hate.
Yeah.
And if you don't look at the impact it had on African Americans, then you're missing a really big point. And so, yes, have your heritage. I don't begrudge anybody's heritage. It's just when it impinges on mine and ours, and that keeps us, because a lot of these statutes were put in place after, to after Reconstruction, after the civil rights, to put us in our place. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's interesting that these statues were cemented in a place that are usually central in a town to let us know what our place is. I was working on my PhD in counseling psych in Richmond, Virginia Commonwealth University. And I would have to drive down Monument Avenue every day. And that was in the 80s. And it was like literally the cannon fire, the fodder, the rifle, the whatever was going straight into my psyche.
Mm.
And I ultimately left the program because I, number one, wasn't wanting to pursue academia, but secondly, I needed to really become a poet and start creatively dealing with these things that I felt.
Yeah. Tell us a little more about your journey as a poet. You had mentioned a little bit about what inspired you to step into that. Um, but I know in one of your poems you're talking about as a child, the like that you there wasn't that sort of broader picture or understanding about where your parents, grandparents had come from,
Right.
what they were, why they were making the choices that they were making. So if you could speak a little bit about that and your journey as a poet, that'd be great.
It's so hard to tell the journey because I feel like I have entered into poetry on so many doors, and so many windows, and so many times that poetry has come into my life to make me a poet. But I think as a child, I was highly sensitive, which is really hard when you're raised in a family of soldiers and athletes. And I was an athlete as well. But I'm not saying they were insensitive. I'm saying I was highly sensitive. And so that made me an outlier with my family. I was always the one with my nose in a book and always getting my feelings hurt. And then always very strange. Authors were my best friends.
Yeah.
And they just didn't quite understand who I was, even though I have a very artistic and creative family, more musicians in the church, but I was the outlier of the book nerd sort of person. But I really felt like we never called art in our family. Art was kind of like that, making something out of nothing. It's just what you do. You sing, you dance, that's what you do. You express yourself. So I think I always felt like an artist. I wish somebody would have told me earlier that I was a poet, because it caused me a lot of distress, because I was always taking in and trying to process these tough emotions. And I think the thing that solidified poetry for me is when we moved. My father was in the military, and we moved back to the South in 1976. And it was a culture shock. We moved from Aviano, Italy to McGuire Air Force in New Jersey to Piedmont, South Carolina. And my parents never had the discussion of, this is the context, this is what's gonna happen. You're used to being around all people, all faiths, and and now you're gonna go and it's black and white, and the civil rights movement is, for all intents and purposes, haven't happened.
Wow.
So you sit a sensitive being, soul, and plunk them down into that. I was just obliterated emotionally. And so I had to come to terms with that. And one way I started to write, and I had a teacher who had assigned a journal writing exercise. And in that journal is when I started to gain a sense of agency and voice, and start saying, hey, it's not me, it's it's not me. It is this crazy place that I have been plunked down into. Not to say I love my state. I write so much about my state. And I think that was really, in some ways, even though it cost me a great bit, it really gave me the leverage to own South Carolina. Out of all the 5 kids, I'm the only one born in South Carolina. I was born in Sumter, Shaw Air Force Base. My brother before me was born in Evreux, France. So I had issues with him being born in an exotic place like France, and then me, they're like, "Where are you born?" Evreux, France, and I'm like, "Where are you born?" Sumter, South Carolina. And it was I had issues with that for a long, long time, and then once I started writing poetry again, back again in my 30s, I started looking around. I had one particular artist. His name is Jonathan Green, and he he is a visual artist. He's a Gullah Geechee landscape portraiture artist, and he really instilled in me write about where you're from. Know where you're from. And it wasn't until I went down to Charleston, South Carolina, and I thought I was going on a vacation. You know, that's the port where my people were brought in from West Africa. And that opened me up. And teachers told me all the time, write about what you know. Well, I really didn't know as a military kid until I started to investigate South Carolina. So learning about South Carolina and getting my bearings and standing fully in South Carolina and learning to love it as well as take it to task was me. That's what really made me a poet and part of my journey of becoming a poet. My father also, though he was in the military for 21 years, he was a jazz, blues, gospel pianist and who only played by ear. And so we had music in our household all the time. And so that gave me a sense of rhythm. His ear, I'm not musically inclined, I'm a dancer, but I'm not a musician. But that's fed my poetry, that rhythm, and then growing up in the Black church, the Black Baptist preachers, that cadence, that fed me. But again, I would have to point to my mother. She's a seamstress, and she is a seamstress and an amazing cook, and her sense of timing too feeds my work. So I really see myself as a kind of a blue collar poet, and that's not to diminish my work. That's to fully embrace the people of the land and the people I come from. And so I'm trying to write in that vein. I mean, there's a lot of academic poets, and I have my MFA in poetry, but that work feels a little bit different. I'm trying to do something a little bit different. I'm trying to really be close to the land and close to the people.
Yeah.
So, you know, no one has really fully made a living as an artist except for me. I'm the only one who was crazy enough to pursue that.
Well, good for you. And it sounds like the fact that you have did not stay, that you didn't grow up fully in the South, that you had these other experiences in different societies, different communities where the black, white, that was not the issue. That was not a, central focus to the community. That may have been really a great gift.
It was a gift. I think it was a gift and a curse because I felt like I lived in a bubble for the
Mm.
first 2 years of my life. It was so beautiful. Not to say there was no racism, there was, but it was not to the level as it was in the civilian population. So the fact that you can mandate people to integrate, but you can't really legislate the heart. And
Right.
so we had sleepovers, we were social, we went to interfaith gatherings. My friends who were Catholic, I went to their service. My friends who were Jewish, we sampled. It wasn't so written in stone. It wasn't very dogmatic. And so I, had this kind of lens of that's the way the world should be. We are supposed to experience each other's cultures, food, and ways of being, and not diminish it, but embrace it. It was just a matter of fact sort of thing to me. And so when I came and had this rude awakening that this is not the way things are, and of course my parents had it rough. I mean, and I knew about those things, but I did not witness them really firsthand until I came back to the South. And I think being a other or a vagabond or whatever outsider is very crucial in the work of a poet, because you're not as invested in what people think about you. You're not that aligned to, oh, I got to do this. I got to be the, this person for this. It gave me that sense of I'm on the fringe, so I can tell this story.
Yeah.
These
Yeah.
stories, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I want to ask you about one other thing in terms of I know that you've done a lot of time driving on the road, teaching
Yeah.
as a performance poet, right? Performing your poems.
Yes.
I would love to hear about some of your experiences, or in general, what your audiences were like, even, and what kind of responses you were getting in those touring performances.
Well, it was varied, and because I crossed into a lot of communities. I felt like I've had one of the best educations a person can get of America. Because when people start talking about America, I'm like, which America are you talking about?
Right.
You're
Yeah.
talking about the powwows in Washington State? Are you talking about the Amish community? Are you talking about, you know, um, the affluent in, upstate New York? I mean, what are you talking about? Because there's just so many avenues into all of these different places. And so, there are cultural differences, and those differences are important. And I felt like I got schooled very early on. Like I said, I grew up in a very Black Baptist call and response kind of situation. So when I did poetry, I'm used to people saying, uh-huh, go on, girl, hallelujah,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
talking back. And that is not a rude thing. Although I would go into schools and they would be like predominantly Black, but they were all white teachers. And I would come in and do a poem, and all the Black kids are standing up in the bleachers. They're shouting and catching the spirit and going, just talking to me. And the teacher's like, shh, shh. And think that they're being rude. And they don't understand that that's a cultural difference,
Yeah.
that they're showing me a sign of respect, because where we were trained, if you didn't talk back, that was rude. Then
Right.
I went to a Presbyterian church and I'm doing my poems, and it is complete silence. And the thought bubble, if you could read it over my head, was, I am bombing. I am failing. This is horrible. Get me out of here. And I would get finished with my reading, and these people would get up on their feet, standing ovation, with tears streaming down, and was saying, that was lovely. And I'm like, well, why did you let me go? But that is what I mean about the cultural differences. I was schooled in that way, and it's quite beautiful if you think about it. One is not better than the other. They're just different.
Yeah.
And of course, I get more mileage when I'm with my folks, and we're going back and forth, But there's just as much beauty in silence and this reverence of the work, where, there's not a clap after the poem. It's just that kind of sacred silence that you get in nature. And
Yeah.
it's pregnant and it's full and it's beautiful. So, I get perceived, in a lot of different ways. But what I find, once you get in there and you start telling your stories, that it's not, I think we can be fooled by what's on the outside, because what hopefully is in any good poem or any good work of art is that there's a universal thread that's running through it. And so, whether I'm speaking the colloquial tongue of my ancestors, or I'm speaking as a teaching artist or a poet, or I'm speaking about my walk as a Black woman in America, hopefully there's a thread of humanity that's running through that. Because I've had people come up to me and say, when you talk about your grandmother, that's my grandmother that you're talking about. And that's people, from all walks of life are saying that.
Yeah.
I had a grandmother who smoked Winston's and, and recycled, and, just was just, irreverent in these ways that, people who were born in 1901 can be.
Yeah.
And so that has taught me, we have to just be ourselves and let the stories do the work.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Well, I wanna thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about this, and just really excited that, we're getting this work out there in a bigger way.
Well, I want to thank you because this has been one of the tasks that I gave myself this year, having cancer and then going through COVID throughout the year, is to get this work on audio. And it's been the best medicine for me. And I'm just so excited about the book. And I'm really excited about having, Lyric Lita Jones music being featured. She is actually um, one of I have twin daughters. She's a classmate of theirs from Asheville High School in North Carolina. And she would sing. We see her singing out busking. And so it's just one of these harmonious things. And then to have my brother on the project as well. So I feel like Will Redmond, who brought me this music for What My Hands Say, he did it about maybe 3 years ago, of J-Pod, the Beat Chef. And my brother is one of my biggest fans. He listens to my music in the car, my poems in the car, and then he'll make musical arrangements from them. So I don't know how more fan you can get. So this
That's
is,
beautiful.
it is. Just send me stuff and go, look what I did with this poem. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's so cool. So this has been a labor of love, and I appreciate working with the team that you all presented, and it's just been powerful for me. And I look forward to doing my next book with you all, The Listening Skin, which is all about having fibromyalgia and cancer and living through poverty and racism. So
Yeah, beautiful. Well, again, thank you so much.
thank you, Becky. Bye-bye.